Reggie Gibson, the African-American poet, once said, "Our problem as Americans is that we actually hate history, and what we love instead is nostalgia." Now, I teach history to adolescents and have been doing so for almost 20 years now. Who doesn't love the odd bit of nostalgia? But hating history, no, certainly not me. But admittedly, the teaching of history can be difficult, as the teaching of history means the uncovering of truths. It forces one to bring up all kinds of emotions that can be uncomfortable. And also it forces one to question their morality. Nothing has grabbed my attention and stolen my passion more than teaching about the civil rights movement. It has been transformational for me, for the way that I see the world and the way that I am in the world. It has helped me be much more aware of my own privilege as a comfortably well-off white woman living in London. It's also helped me be a better ally, to give voice to those who have struggled to be heard. I teach about the American civil rights movement as more than history, but as my mission to empower young people to be active citizens and to equip them with the tools to challenge injustice. I want my students to be heroes. Years ago, in my American history class, when I used to teach at an international school, a student of mine, let's call him Peter, came into my class one morning and slumped in his chair. "I don't want to be an American," he declared. "As soon as I get the chance, I'm leaving." I could see he was anguished, and when I pressed him to find out more, he told me that he just didn't feel that the United States deserved to be even called a democracy. He didn't feel that it deserved the headline, "Land of the Free and Home of the Brave." Now, I could tell that Peter was going through a rite of passage, one that history teachers begin to understand that adolescents do experience when they realize that their country isn't perfect. Peter's bubble had burst. So I asked Peter if he had any other countries in mind that he would choose to live in instead. And he came up with 2 or 3 options. But soon, the other students in the class quickly challenged him, noting the difficulties that those countries experienced as well. So I asked the class, "Do you want to live in a country without any problems?" And soon a discussion emerged where the children questioned the value of whether or not it was important to spend your life in a country where there was worthy work to do. But it was Peter from the back of the class who exclaimed, and he said, "But Emma, we can't all be extraordinary. We can't all be Martin Luther King." And he was right. What I needed to do as Peter's teacher was deliver the stories of ordinary heroes or ordinary people who make a difference. It was important for me to be able to show Peter that ordinary people can make a difference even when the spotlight is absent. So, in the summer of 2017, my school sent me to Memphis, Tennessee, in order to attend an educational conference that was put on to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Martin Luther King. It was the most wonderful week, but I wanted to understand and uncover the stories of these ordinary people, and so I traveled further. From Memphis, I headed south into the area called the Mississippi Delta, and then east into the heartland of Alabama. It was July 2017, a mere few days before white supremacists marched on Charlottesville, Virginia. Confederate statues and flags swept the landscape, and urban areas, for the most part, remained racially divided. And no matter where I went, And no matter the color of their skin, people would look me up and down, listening to my confused mid-Atlantic accent, and say to me, "Ma'am, you're not from around here, are you?" And I replied and said to them, "I'm a teacher, and I want to understand your story." As I traveled, people told me time and again that the civil rights movement was shaped by the mamas and their babies. For they said that it was the women who, often deep into the night, would plan together, photocopy, have coffee, network, build communities, and build relationships. And one such woman I would like to tell you about today, and her name is Joanne Bland. I met Joanne on a steamy morning in Selma, Alabama. I had been told that it was important to meet Joanne because she had been involved in a landmark historical event, the march from Selma to Montgomery in March of 1965. And she had been 11 years old at the time. Now, Joanne had been quite difficult to pin down, admittedly, and I had been persistent. And I had emailed her 25 times or so. So when I got out of the car, she looked at me and she said to me, "You is a bossy lady." And then she said, "You must come from a line of bossy women." I liked her. From the moment I met her, she was bold, she was courageous. She had an immense sense of wisdom for how to affect change. And she had gone through a very difficult time. As we walked and talked, Joanne told me her story. She told me that she didn't realize that she was Black until she was 8 years old. Later, I tried to understand and really reflect on what she meant. And I figured that what she meant was she didn't realize what being Black in Selma in the 1960s meant until she was 8 years old. And she told me a story which illustrated this. She had been in a department store with her grandmother, buying shoes that were only meant for white feet. Soon, the clerk came over to the grandmother and said, "Ma'am, you gotta buy these shoes." But they weren't the right size. So Joanne's grandmother held up a piece of string that she had used to measure Joanne's feet. Joanne's grandmother said to the clerk, "I'll gladly pay for them," she said, "if you get me a different pair of shoes." But the clerk replied, and forgive me for using the words that Joanne told me herself, but she said, "No, lady, you don't understand. You gotta buy these shoes because that nigger put her feet in them." A year later, Joanne was arrested. She was with her grandmother again, but this time she was with a group of women who were heading to the Selma courthouse to register to vote. In the 1960s in Alabama, you could be lynched as an African American for registering to vote. Promptly, this group of women were arrested, herded onto a bus, headed for the city jail. Joanne doesn't remember how long they were there for, but what she does remember is playing on the floor of the cell and singing with those women. 3 years later, at the age of 11, on the 7th of March, 1965, on a spring morning, Joanne joined her fellow activists on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, ready to march to Montgomery. Her friends and her neighbors were pummeled, beaten, and clubbed by Alabama state troopers who were mounted on horses as tear gas was emitted as clouds into the air. Fleeing the chaos, Joanne found herself in the car with her older sister, Linda, and she lay her head on Linda's lap for relief and comfort. But as she did, she felt a wetness on her cheek, and expecting it to be Linda's tears, she looked up at Linda's head, where she saw a gash dripping with blood that would require 26 stitches. 2 weeks later, Joanne, together with thousands of others and Martin Luther King, marched successfully from Selma to Montgomery. And in the summer of 1965, President Johnson then passed the Voting Rights Act. Spending time with Joanne was hilarious and poignant, and at times, as you can see, very serious. I was incredibly grateful to her for sharing the history of her hometown and her personal story with me as she continued to share her story with many others, then becoming the founder of the National Voting Rights Museum in Selma, Alabama. But she left me with one final message. She said to me, "We all live with a history of racial inequality that is a burden to us." She said it's like a smog that prevents us from breathing and it prevents us from being healthy. "Emma," she said to me, "we cannot sugarcoat the teaching of history. We can't just teach what's easy. We got to tell it, and then we've got to face it." I'd never heard of Joanne before that summer, but I'll certainly never forget her. And I brought her stories and the stories of many other ordinary people back to my classroom to breathe life into the facts and infuse my students with the spirit to be active citizens. So, to my students, past, present, and future, if you sense injustice in the hallways of your classroom or on the streets of your neighborhood, and you feel a fire burning through your veins, it is up to you to do something, for even something small, for there is much work still to be done. Take inspiration from the mamas and their babies and all the ordinary heroes, and march on. Thank you.